Today at the FAI headquarters in the National Sports Campus, we finally got to see the full scale of the debts facing the FAI. The story is stark and bleak. To help us interpret the facts and figures, I'm delighted to say we have with us this evening Dr. Robbie Butler from the Department of Economics in UCC. Robbie, good evening to you. How are you doing?
Good evening, George. Thanks for having me.
You know, a number of headlines in terms of the 55 million figure that I think we've kind of known for about 24 hours. That was crystallised today and made clear that's the outstanding debt at the FAI. There's a loss figure for last year, which is absolutely very stark and which suggests that the business is in trouble. Perhaps one of the key lines to take away is that Deloitte have said that they're concerned about the ability of the FAI to trade as a going concern. That was the one that struck me as the most important in all this, the fact that perhaps this might be the end of the FAI as it's currently constituted.
Well, I think there's a few elements to what you ask. I think, I think at a general level, I think everybody that has an association or affiliation or a love of Irish soccer is very, saddened by what we saw today. The overall net liability figure is worrying. For an association that turns over about 45 million euros a year to have a net liability of, 55 million is something that should be of concern. I think, from the point of view of the viability of the Football Association, I think we have to be careful in terms of what Deloitte are recommending. Of course, they say that this is a company that mightn't be a going concern. I think, this is a little bit different to, say, normal private companies that, we might consider or we might look at. Because football in Ireland, well, it's administered by the Football Association, and whilst it is a private entity as such, it does have a public element. It receives money from the taxpayer, and it also has a public good. And the public good is something that, football fans and supporters are drawn to. So despite the fact that the association that administers the game is in financial difficulty, I don't think football in this country is, simply because it's owned by the people that play it, the people that volunteer, and the people at grassroots level.
Okay, I totally understand exactly the point you're making, that the sport itself will continue, but the administration of the sport by the FAI, we now see that those total net liabilities are 55 million. Why are Deloitte saying that they're concerned about the ability of the FAI to continue being a going concern?
Well, I think it's standard practice for any private company that would be in such a financial position to say that. I don't think there's anything out of the ordinary there. I think the worrying thing for the association is that, an adjustment is going to be required. And I suppose just living in this country for the past decade, an adjustment was required because there was a certain amount of money coming in and there was a certain amount of money going out, and the money that going out was much more than was coming in. So if you look at the key stakeholders involved in the association, and if you look at the cost side of the business, by far the biggest is staffing. And I think this is something that's worrying and it's concern, particularly before Christmas, that, if this company is to become in line, is to become viable and sustainable, it's probably going to mean, if not pay cuts, redundancies. Again, I would say, the Football Association is different in this regard, so far as it doesn't have to be profit maximising. It certainly should be revenue maximising, so we should be trying to generate as much revenue as we can from the international teams, from sponsorship, from commercial and so on. But the objective should be to break even, and to break even with that constraint. Once we can break even, I think it becomes a different issue. It doesn't necessarily have to become profit maximising or make profit. In fact, it shouldn't. It should reinvest any money it makes into things like grassroots, into the League of Ireland, into underage football.
Talk to us about the 55 million then. I understand there's a lot of information to get through today, given that accounts for 2 separate years were published, and it's about 70 odd pages of quite detailed financial information to parse. But where did the 55 million come from?
It's largely bank debt, and some of the bank debt would have been the legacy of the Aviva, and I guess the issue with the Aviva was the Aviva Stadium was supposed to be debt-free by 2020, and that was something that we heard quite a bit. I guess some of this is a legacy of the crisis that Ireland went through. The Aviva happened to come on stream just as the Irish economy was collapsing, and much of the debt that is there now, it would never have been envisaged that Ireland would have been under such economic conditions at the time. So the objective to pay off much of that debt in the early years simply it didn't come to fruition because the economy was in a completely different place. I guess the worrying thing now is that the mortgage on the Aviva has been extended until 2034. So that's a long way from where we thought we would have been.
Can I just on that though, like there's nothing actually wrong with having a debt associated with your stadium if you can pay off the debt. Like everybody who has a mortgage understands that you pay your mortgage off over a period of time, you make sure the repayments are within your means to pay, and ultimately that's fine so long as the debt's serviceable, right?
Sure, but I guess the more worrying thing is that the mortgage was supposed to be paid by 2020, and now 14 years have been added to the mortgage. So what does that mean in terms of interest, in terms of the actual sustainability of the stadium in the long run? Because it's more than just the mortgage we have to pay back. The stadium gets older, it requires maintenance, and so on. And just particularly with interest on that, that's essentially money that could be used for something else. There's an opportunity cost on it. So we're going to have 14 years of payments towards the stadium that could have been spent somewhere else. Now, I do accept that, it's not a big an issue if it's manageable, sure, but it's going to have to be managed for 15 years more than was originally intended. Yeah,
I think that 2020 figure was always a strange figure to have been introduced to the conversation anyway, because there was always that difficulty with the Vantage tickets. There was that debt. It seemed like it was a race to get that paid off for whatever reason, and maybe that will emerge in time with some of the other reports. But as an association, if the 55 million is largely bank debt and it's now going to be spaced over 15 years, does that give them some breathing space?
Sure, and some of it, I suppose, is due to the fact, and this is the net liability. Some of it is due to the fact that there was difficulties paying back bank debt recently. So something that would have appeared as a long-term liability now appears as a current liability. So once that debt becomes manageable, and we believe now that the association is renegotiating debt, and I mean that's something that countries do. It's something that Ireland did quite successfully over the past 5-10 years. If that can happen, of course, it puts us in a better position. And I think this is part of the adjustment that the association is going to have to go through. So if you return a loss of nearly €9 million in 2018, we have to hope now that if this goes into 2019, that things will begin to recover in 20 and 21 and 22 because of the actions that have been taken. I guess going back to the international team, often people think of the FAI, they think of the senior men's international team. Obviously, it's a lot more than that. But that team is very, very important to the association in terms of revenue generation. It's second only to commercial revenue. So the two games that that are potentially ahead of us in Bratislava, and then, well, we don't know after that, but a final. It's of critical importance now, more so than from a footballing perspective, that we actually qualify for Euro 2020 because of the rewards associated with that in terms of broadcasting, commercial, merchandising, and so on.
You mentioned the loss in 2018, the 9 million loss in 2018. What were the key drivers behind that?
Yeah, sure. So there's two sides to it. Unfortunately, turnover is reduced by about 4 million, and cost of sales, operating costs have actually risen. So what that does is it drives you in a position where you're about just 3 million to nearly 9 million in the red. I suppose, again, one caveat on that, the debt was about 5.5 million, and then there was grants to affiliates, development programs and so on. That consisted of about 3.5 million euros. So, I mean, that is something that could have been retained by the association, but it wasn't. So it's pretty much a combination of less money coming in, more money going out, that's driven this figure to be 8.9 million.
Okay. The other thing that's happened over the course of the fact that we had these two separate publications of the accounts and that they were delayed for such a long period of time was because they had to be revisited. There was so much that was in the accounts that had previously been published where not all the information was known, I think it's fair to say. That has in turn resulted in a further liability in these accounts, adding to that 55 million figure. Is that correct?
Yeah, so some of the things adjusted for in the accounts are to do with the fact that information that wasn't known prior has become known. So, for example, there's a tax liability that's now included, right? And that's a positive step because we're now planning for the future and I suppose a worst case scenario. I guess to go back to a point you made a minute ago, just about sponsorship, and I think because Tree's agreement has come to an end, it's so important that we get this right now, because we now want to be in a position where we have an association and I suppose football administered in this country that, you know, sponsorship and companies want to be involved with, because they're now a crucial driver of what happens. And I think this is a great opportunity to do that, to really, you know, revisit what's happened, and let's hope this is it. I guess, I suppose the one concern we would have is that something else would come to light, and my hope today is this is the end of it, and that, you know, what happens from here on out is an adjustment towards sustainability and positive news.
Yeah, because I mean, it's been death by a thousand cuts with the various stories that have come out. The one that barely even got mentioned was the fact that a second kit deal had been done, and there's a few lines qualifying why they have to repay back money that they had already drawn down. This was the Mike Ashley deal that got done, and I think there's probably quite a bit more to play out when it comes to that. So I don't know if there's even a provision for liabilities or potential future liabilities down the road from interested parties around that case. Was there anything else, Robbie, when you were reading this that kind of jumped out at you as going,
no,
wow?
You know, I wasn't even familiar with that when you said it, so it really did go under the radar. No, not particularly. I think replacing Tree is going to be very, very important. Ireland obviously has a very long association. We were the first international association to ever put a sponsorship on our jersey, and I think we remain the only one. If not, there are very few others. So having Tree on the front of an international jersey or a sponsor is very, very unusual. Opel were the original case and followed on by Aircom and so on. But I think replacing them with a sponsorship agreement that's going to be of similar standing is very, very important. I think the other thing that's crucially important is convincing the government that they can reinstate the nearly €3 million that goes towards grassroots football. In the grander scheme of things, when you're turning over 45 million, you know, it isn't as significant as some might believe, but it is a significant amount of money, particularly when you're losing 8-9 million a year.
Yeah. Can I just ask you about the general sense of sports governance? Because there was a really interesting piece by Emmett Malone today where he was saying that he didn't think anything that was going to come out today was going to be able to shock us, given how much has already come out and the fact that this has been such a shit show, effectively, for such a long period of time. I actually don't remember anything in Irish sports administration history on the scale of what we're hearing today, that this is an association which was clearly out of control. Is there anything hopeful for football fans from this today?
Well, I guess I wasn't too shocked either, and maybe that's because we're kind of prepared. When you're told this is going to be shocking, maybe then your kind of benchmark level adjusts. So I wasn't terribly shocked by what I saw and read today. I guess, again, to go back to something I would have said earlier, sports are strange in that regard, that they have a private element and they have a public element, and people are emotional about them. And when you're running a sport through a private vehicle, there's a certain incentive structure, and that incentive structure often doesn't match up with the public good. So I think you're always going to be in this bind when it comes to sport, and the FAI are not alone in this regard. And you know, this is not the first crisis that's hit the association, and I think it's very, very difficult to manage the competing incentives, where you want people to behave in the interest of a private organisation but also in the public good. I think what it needs is, you know, extremely detailed and effective kind of codes of conduct, and you know, it's probably something, because this is, you know, such a deep crisis. You know, out of a crisis comes opportunities. This is a really good opportunity to change what we've done for, you know, quite some time, and really change the way the association is run.
Yeah, the accounts are very clear as well in the notes that there wasn't enough oversight, and that is clearly true. Donald Conway today in the press conference was saying that he'd never had a conversation with John Delaney, despite the fact he was the president of the FAI, about the CEO's remuneration. He said that only certain board members were allowed to do that, which just goes to show you that there wasn't enough oversight / any proper oversight at the time.
Well, I think everybody can learn from this, and I'm sure Sport Ireland and those that, other stakeholders and those that fund sport, particularly from a government level, have learned from this to try and ensure that it doesn't happen again in any sport, in any code in this country. And I think if that happens, at least some good will have come of this situation.
Yeah, you bring up an excellent point. Sport Ireland eventually get involved and eventually precipitate the investigations that we're having at the moment because of the public funding that is going into the FAI. But they could have done this years ago. They could have had a look at this years ago. And no doubt when the dust settles from the FAI's perspective, we're going to be looking at the Department of Sport and we're going to be looking at Sport Ireland and going, well, what were you guys doing when this was actually happening? You continue to hand over money year after year after year after year. Shane Ross was on News Talk saying that he was fine with John Delaney being the chief executive. He was fine taking tickets to matches at the same time. And you just have to wonder if this isn't just an FAI story now, that if it is actually a much broader story that also takes in Sport Ireland and also takes in the Department of Sports.
Well, I guess there's a couple of things there. One, in terms of the amount of money you're putting in. So I guess the more money that goes in, the more responsible the Sport Ireland is in terms of the funding. But in the case of the FAI, the amount that is contributed is, as I said, is relatively small. In that sense, I suppose the second thing is you always have to be careful, particularly from a football point of view, is that one of the criteria to be an affiliate member of UEFA and FIFA is that there has to be no government intervention. So you will have seen cases of federations being fined or banished, excluded completely from competitions because of direct government intervention. And that's something designed to protect a very different situation to the one we have in Ireland. But we do always have to be conscious of that. Whilst government oversight is required, there's a limit on that, particularly in terms of the Football Association of Ireland and our membership of UEFA and FIFA.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that as well. And they look with a dim view on any government meddling, but at the same time, now all government funding comes with the ability to audit all of your finances if you are a sports organisation. I just want to ask you one last thing, because
Sure.
the 55 million figures obviously doing the rounds. What would an acceptable level of debt be, a manageable, serviceable level of debt be for an organisation that is turning over between 40 and 50 million?
I really don't know, to be honest. I think, I'm not sure, because obviously I'm not an accountant, so I'm not privy to accounts like that, or I wouldn't look at accounts on a regular basis. But I guess any sort of debt is fine once it's manageable. But the issue is if it becomes unmanageable, well, then it becomes a problem. And I think the fear we have for the FAI and for the Football Association is that the debt is becoming unmanageable. Yeah.
All right, Robbie Butler, thanks a million for joining us today and giving us your take on what's happened with the FAI today. Obviously, this is a developing story, and we'll be continuing to follow it on offtheball.com, so stay tuned to that and to our social channels as we bring you more information. We understand that the FAI have addressed, the board have addressed staff in Abbottstown this evening as well, so not a great time for them, and I'm sure very concerning given that job cuts and pay cuts are definitely on the agenda at the moment. We'll take a break.